So, the storming of the US Capitol earlier this year. As a geopolitical scientist that you are, could you have imagined that to have occurred?
Well,
the last people who stormed this place was the Canadians.
Well, it was the British.
The
British force landed in 1814 in Washington and attacked the Capitol, and James Madison had to flee. So, but it was the British in the War of 1812, and something comparable to this didn't even happen during the Civil War. Union, so it was in that sense an unprecedented event. I mean, you can always trace the underlying trends that led up to it. I mean, one of the challenges, for those who are familiar with the Black Swan as event as defined by Taleb, is that it's often explainable retroactively, right? So if you're looking retrospectively, rather, you can look back and say, well, that was obvious based on the underlying forces at the time. But the reality of an unknown is it's something you can't really forecast. I don't think it quite met that standard in this case, because the fundamental piece of disinformation that lay behind the Capitol storming were the constant attacks on the validity of the election by President Trump, by Donald Trump. And those attacks were being made going back to prior to the actual election date on November 3rd. So that fundamental piece of disinformation that lay behind that attack was clearly visible before the event.
This is why it's a Black Swan event. Anthropologically, it's pretty logical. The echo chambers, the rhetoric that was going on, and then if we go back in not too distant history, as we're looking at Arab Spring, was probably something equivalent.
Right. I think
when's the next one?
Well, I mean, you're right in that sense. Maybe it is. I mean, it can be defined as a Black Swan because I think it was beyond our frame of reference. So, it was beyond the perception, the common perception of what was conceivable in the world, right? The very notion
Sally's asked whether the Restream IO for the which way am I pointing? That way is actually free. It's free software. So I'm testing out something that we can all use, and then quickly switching over to Alexi. What will be opposite to anthropologically obvious? Well, something that wouldn't have made sense. Hard to put an example of that one.
Yeah.
Well, space aliens would probably be not an anthropologically obvious thing because you couldn't connect the dots on that.
No.
Sorry. So let's go back to it. So where do you think it's going to happen next? What's the next kind of unexpected little Black Swan?
Well, that's by definition a priori. It's not possible for me to forecast that. I mean, perennial challenge with forecasting.
We're not forecasting. This is foresight.
Well, yeah.
Foresight,
if it's an exercise in strategic foresight, then you can imagine new futures. I mean, in the geopolitical space, the one that is certainly a known unknown, and in this case isn't strictly a Black Swan, but is U.S.-China conflict. I mean, that's the sort of nightmare scenario focused on the South China Sea. That is certainly a known unknown.
But one area that you mentioned in one of your recent papers is that the economic ties between these two superpowers was very different to in the past.
That's true. I mean, if you looked at the Soviet Union, at its peak, the trade between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was, I think, like about $5 billion a year. It's that much a day between the U.S. and China. So the level of economic integration, particularly in the not in the technological realm, particularly in the goods trade realm, is quite substantial. Increasingly, you're seeing partition in the technological space. That's why some would argue we're in a tech Cold War, but not in a Cold War as we define it in, have we lost Bruce?
No, I've maximized you. You know, give it. You know, you were the star of this.
Well, no, this is good to know, Bruce, because you disappear from the screen, and that it's good to know that that'll happen for one of our speakers, that we might see the host disappear. Anyway, as I was saying, I think that in that sense, there is something novel about the current situation. That said, the comparison, maybe the more appropriate comparison that's often made geopolitically as a sort of applied history exercise, is the lead up to 1914 and the competition between then Imperial Germany and Britain. Because at that point in time, those two countries were actually highly integrated. I think they were each other's largest trading partner. You're talking about what is often referred to as the first age of globalization, particularly Eurocentric, in highly integrated European economies. And you, in that case, had theses at the time, geopolitical thinkers at the time, arguing that this economic integration made war. And this was famously put forward by a thinker named Norman Angell in a book published, I think, in 1911 called The Great Illusion, which basically argued that war in Europe was unthinkable because of the economic integration that existed on the continent. It was irrational. It wasn't impossible, but it was certainly irrational and therefore highly unlikely to happen. Well, 3 years later, the First World War began. So that's often held up as the case, a counter argument to the US-China economic integration argument, that is, integration doesn't preclude conflict. And in an era of strategic competition, as it's now defined, certainly in Washington, that's motivating, to some extent, economic disintegration or economic partition or decoupling. Does that increase, or rather lower, the costs of conflict economically, which increases its probability? I would argue, and I think, Bruce, you and I argued in the paper, that the notion of disintegration or decoupling is overplayed. Interestingly, Jeremy Green, who's a professor at Cambridge, makes a similar argument where he distinguishes between the globalizing condition and the force of globalization. Globalization is the process of interconnectivity, whereas the globalized condition is a state of heavy integration, of deep integration. We're in the midst of a globalized condition. That's a product of hyperglobalization of particularly the post-Cold War era. The trends are towards deglobalization, but that doesn't change the realities of the globalized condition. And so, although the trends have slowed down and to some extent reversed in certain domains, the overall condition is one of heavy globalization, which is unlikely to sort of return to any sort of 1930s scenario of coupling.
You don't see any bifurcation, in particular with, say, supply chains, with electronic standards, with even the internet. It's end up having two internets, one that's Sino-centric and one that is US-centric. You don't see that on the cards?
Well, then that's that. I say to some extent, yes. I mean, that's where the tech Cold War plays in. That's one domain of globalization, though. It's a pretty important one, and increasingly so. And as economies switch more and more, when you have a heavy weighting towards services that are digitally provided, it becomes a large portion of the economy. But are you seeing the same thing in energy? No. Are you seeing necessarily the same thing in goods trade? No. When it comes to low-cost manufacturing, the prospect of mass reshoring to the US is I think, fairly low. So the idea is that you get deglobalization in certain domains, but not across the entire aggregate. And I think that's the distinguishing feature. I think I was going to add, the Splinternet example that you raise, I think is a good one. There's also the idea of a European internet domain as well that's distinct from the American one. And I think that's one of the tension points that the Biden administration has to deal with, which is this whole idea of restoring American leadership in the economic and political domain, to a certain extent, rests on an assumption that Europe and the US can quite easily work out differences and become well aligned on a lot of issues, including on things like technology. And the reality is, there's not that alignment. The European Union has a very different idea of what privacy means, right, than the US. GDPR goes a lot further, certainly than federal standards in the United States do now. You have certain states like California that have tried to adopt some of that European approach. But for the most part, there are some pretty distinct differences. Competition law, right? You see the EU being a lot more, I wouldn't say hardline, but more active in regulating big tech. The critics would say it's because they don't have any big tech rivals of their own to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, particularly the new AI regulations they're proposing is so different to the US standards.
They're all about ethical AI and you know that I think Europe sees itself, that's their competitive advantage, as being a regulatory superpower, right? That they can set the road for regulation. And because they're a 500 million strong market that is important both to China and the United States to sell into that market, that they can, to some extent, pull the rest of the world along with them. So the GRI account we're getting, sorry, Bruce, I'm seeing that in the feed.
Yes, and that's actually Julie.
That's Julie. Okay,
yeah,
great.
I pinged Julie to see whether it works, just to get her on as well.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I'm glad it's working there. So we've got 3. So that'll be Sally, Alexi, and Julie. Okay. So yeah, I was saying, I think in the technology space, and I put out a paper about this last year, the year prior, on the geopolitics of technology, that focused on big data, AI, and 5G telecom, where you're seeing very much that splinter net play out. Some domains more than others. I would say 5G, you'd find the US and increasingly countries in Northern Europe aligned. I mean, you've had the UK.
Julie's enjoying your conversation, by the way, Eric.
Great. Fantastic. You've seen the UK exclude Huawei from its 5G network. You've seen, to some extent, a similar trend in Germany and in France, but there still is that divide there. A lot of countries in Europe don't want to choose between the United States and China, certainly on economic issues. In the defense space, it's pretty clear they're treaty allies with the United States, but a lot of European countries are very weary about how far those dividing lines play out in the economy. Germany, for example, their largest export market, it's an export-heavy economy, is China. The German auto industry, their largest market, is China. It's not the United States or the European Union. It might be within the European internal market, maybe, but certainly at a national basis, the Chinese market is the largest.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interest invested in that relationship. Alexi's asking a question. What is the event that triggered globalization? Or it's more for to say that it was a series of events with none of them being one particular. Well, you'll find a lot of geopolitical analysts that'll point to the global financial crisis as being a key event, in the sense that it certainly philosophically challenged the post-Cold War notion that the liberal US-led model, the Washington Consensus, was a key to, really the only feasible key to economic development. And the global financial crisis burst that illusion, or arguably challenged that idea as a myth. Now that you can argue, whether or not it's the case.
I'd say that'd be the tipping point of the fallacy of compound interest. Trickle-down economics of Reagan kind of worked for only a little while, until it got to a stage where the compound interest just bifurcated society.
Yeah, and you can argue. I mean, economists like Raghu Rajan, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, now at Chicago, wrote quite a renowned book just after the financial crisis called Fault Lines, that traces really from the early 1980s on, the divides that led up to the financial crisis. So you can certainly trace that back to the sort of neoliberal agenda of the early 1980s. So I would say that's maybe one of the most significant variables. At the same time, you have the Ian Bremmer argument, the G0 world. As this is happening, China becomes the second largest economy in the world, I think in 2010, was relatively insulated from the effects of the global financial crisis. And certainly demonstrated an effective alternative for economic growth. So
I'm going to throw in another thing that I think was an effect. All of a sudden, politics moving to real time and being on the news. Then back in the old days, politicians used to negotiate. You never really got to see how the sausages were made, and it was kind of a good thing. Now they can't be seen to compromise, because then it's an ideological discussion, not necessarily, as in, are you the appropriate candidate now because you're willing to comport with the enemy? It's really screwed up. Once again, bifurcated the society.
Yeah. I mean, it's the social media age. It's the age of platform technologies. Increases the velocity of information. The power of networks. Neil Ferguson, the historian, wrote a book back in 2018, Square in the Tower, looked at the power of network technologies, right? And networks are very effective at spreading ideas. It's just those ideas can be both positive or negative, normatively speaking.
It's the printing press.
Right. It's how things go viral. He uses the printing press as a case study, right? You had the printing press facilitated the scientific revolution. It also facilitated a lot of, it was a major factor in religious wars in Europe at the same time, right? So it has, network technologies increase the velocity of ideas, but it's not necessarily a reflection of the effect of those ideas, normatively speaking. So that, and of course, if you think about it, all of these forces were kind of aligning, right? I mean, Facebook, when did Facebook go public? I'm not sure. It was the late 2000s, somewhere in that period.
About 10 years ago, 12 years ago. It really wasn't that long ago.
Right. So it wasn't that long ago, roughly the same time that you get the global financial crisis. As I said, I think China surpassed Japan as the second largest economy in the world back in 2010. By purchasing power parity, it's already larger than the United States. So, a lot of these, I think I'm going to use the academic's favorite answer and say it's complicated. It's, there are many variables that contribute to it.
All right, we're going to pivot now. Middle East.
Middle East.
That's a hot spot. Now you could choose whether you want to actually do, shall I say, more the Israel-Palestine side, or you leave that one completely alone, and concentrate more on, shall we say, Saudi Arabia and go.
Yeah, I mean, I probably will take the latter. The Middle East isn't an area that I personally focus a lot of time upon. It's obviously a very significant geopolitical region. It's a focus for a lot of analysis and attention. I think, I accept to some extent the argument made by thinkers like Robert D. Kaplan, the geopolitical thinker, not the economist, that talks about effectively the return of empires to the Middle East. You're seeing a measure of, at least on the geopolitical space, a measure of multipolarity playing out in the Middle East. Obviously, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is a major one. Israel, Fareed Zakari refers to Israel as the only true superpower now in the Middle East, economically, militarily. Turkey, Egypt, certainly Russia in its relationship with the Assad regime in Syria, and in a United States that under 3 consecutive administrations has pushed to leave the Middle East. And we had most recently, at least in Afghanistan, the Biden administration's announcement of the removal of troops. So you have the U.S. leaving the region and a new form of multipolarity filling that vacuum. And it doesn't. It portends some distress. A distressing future for the Middle East. I don't think. The scale of humanitarian crises across the region, the scale of sectarian violence across the region. I don't think there are clear solutions or paths forward to that. In that sense, I would agree with thinkers like Richard Haas on this subject.
Then now I'll switch over to Russia. So where do you think the bear's going?
Well, it was interesting. We saw the summit with Biden
the
and
summit
Putin
in Sweden, Switzerland, just last week.
Just this last week. It was an interesting summit. I'm not sure how much you can read into it. It was a I think probably aligned with what most people would have forecast. I think Biden certainly was very satisfied with the result in terms of stating quite candidly the U.S.'s position. It's a difficult subject. I think for Russia internally. I mean, Russia internally faces some real challenges demographically, economically, and I think in terms of the political situation, I mean, Putin has now, with the constitutional changes in place, I think he's in a position to, at least by the terms of the Russian constitution, stay in power till 2036. So, the trajectory for Putin's leadership is now secured to some extent for the foreseeable future. But I still think that there is a big question mark around a post-Putin Russia. What does that look like? It reminds me a bit of the arguments made about Bismarckian Germany, that Bismarck had created a diplomatic and political apparatus in 19th century Germany that only he could operate. And with his departure, Germany's foreign policy became a lot more volatile, and internal dynamics became a lot more volatile. What does that portend for a post-Putin Russia? I'm not sure.
So we're actually going to ask a Russian expert.
Yeah, Alexei. What are your thoughts, Alexei?
This is me testing out how we can get multiple people on there and have multiple conversations. Welcome, Alexei. I can't hear you. Still got no audio.
Alexei, try, and you might need to go into settings and make sure that your audio input is set correctly.
The cog on the bottom right underneath your video feed. So this is pretty cool. I can have a speaker going on, and then I have other speakers lined up in the background just to cut in and ask questions direct.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like, Alexei, do you have the YouTube stream in one tab while you're on the Restream? You have two? So that's why you're still registered as viewing the channel while you're participating in the discussion.
Yeah, close your YouTube.
Close your YouTube. We still can't hear you.
How about this? Exit out and then come back in on the link I gave you. with your YouTube closed. And this is why we do tech tests.
Yeah, no, it's useful. I mean, here's a question, Bruce. So in terms of, you could do this video, you could post it. You could also presumably pull the audio and use that as an audio recording as
we'll
well.
let it out as a podcast. Yeah, that was part of the idea as well. You can then chop and change it. It's dare I say it. Podcasts are kind of interesting, but if you're just talking to a microphone and you don't have an eye contact, it's hard to have an engaging conversation. So it's actually easier to do it as a video blog and then just pull the audio off, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Alexi, say something. We're going to see whether we got audio for you.
Still having problems hearing you.
Yeah, I'm not getting any audio feed.
Did you go to audio input, Alexi? Is it saying default, or do you have to switch it to your computer speaker?
So this is from Sally.
I don't know. I'm trying.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. I'm just trying all sorts of things, so one of them worked. That's a rule of thumb. Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna ask your expert opinion on future of Russia, Alexi.
Oh, that's $1 million question for me. Yeah. So definitely, I've been thinking a lot about it. Things that I don't like indeed is that like the beginning of Putin's rule was amazing, was great. We got rid of huge debt, and like internationally, we were amazing. So the relationship with the US, with Europe were great. Now he pretty much nullified all this with this Ukraine event and Georgia event before. So now it's completely the opposite. I think it's worse or almost the same as we had during the Cold War. But when it comes to future of Russia, I would compare this period with the period when the Stalin died in 1953. So it was like a meltdown. And I expect the same thing here because I don't see any successors. Who would he assign? Like the good thing for Yeltsin, for the previous president, is that he was able to find one person who was a very good fit. So, like again, the first 5 years of Putin as a president were great. So he was able to bring all those privately owned companies for oil, for mining companies back to so that they do not, they're state owned. Now they're state owned. So that was a great thing for sure. But now, although it's true, but we still see lots of oligarchs. And recently they increased the pension age. It was 60, now it's 65. And I always tell people who are not familiar with Russia is that the life that Russians live is far from the life like Canadians live and all Western countries live. They all work at 2 or 3 jobs until like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. So it's not like in Europe where you work, you're much more relaxed. So you can work until 65 and you have no issues. But in Russia, pretty much you're exhausted when you're 55 already.
It's slightly changed topic for both of you guys. So I put on this is a little fun mental exercise. So which do you think is more dangerous, the coconut or the shark when you're actually on the beach?
Well, the coconut. I mean, this is a very good dilemma, Bruce. Reminds me a bit. Alexi and I put out a paper on earthquake risk, a survey of earthquakes risk insurance. that looked at the risks to Canada of an earthquake and the effects it might have on the P&C industry, and looked at the two areas that are often pointed to, two regions, geographic regions in Canada that are often pointed to as the highest risk areas. The west coast of Canada, Vancouver, British Columbia, on the San Andreas fault line, and then the other area being, surprising to most, Montreal, and Eastern Ontario, southwestern Quebec. And although in terms of a seismological assessment, the risk on the west coast is much greater, on the east coast, or in Ontario, Quebec, although the seismological risk is lower, the infrastructure, the planning, the insurance system is not necessarily as prepared for that risk because it's not as front and center. So lack of preparation can amplify the what you might call the statistical, the probability of the event, for sure. So a lower probability event that might see that is perceived seemingly as low risk, if not adequately managed, can be the larger source, the most significant source of disaster or of cost. So in that case, the coconut could very well be that risk if you're not thinking about it, if you're not preparing for it, if you're not trying to understand the nature of that risk.
So, Lexi?
Bruce, yes, I suggest, of course, you mean the coconut here, but I'm just, again, the only beach with coconuts which I saw was in Cuba, and I did not see them even close to the beach. So, so that's why kind of from my experience.
So there is actually controversy on the validity of the result here, because and a lot comes to do with data collection. When people get attacked by sharks, usually that you know the numbers. I think last year there was 56 deaths because of sharks, and so a certain number of attacks and whatnot. People actually go out and record the numbers. It goes on the news, and you can actually get some reasonably good stats. The coconut's a little bit different, and so where the coconut ends up being controversial was I think there was a paper back in 1984 talking about how many people died from coconuts hitting them on the head. How many people ended up in hospital because they stepped on a coconut and twisted their ankle or twisted their knee and snapped their ACL and that sort of stuff like that. But it was such a small sample size, it was a small area, but then when it was extrapolated out, it ended up like being supposedly 10 times more than a shark attack.
Yeah,
I don't necessarily believe it because I have a sneaking suspicion that the data analysis was a bit flaky. But it's an interesting little mental exercise when it comes to those little innocuous things could be the things that will get you.
And actually, I was thinking about a catch in this answer, in this question, because again, to my mind, who I was not in Australia or anywhere close to where sharks live, so I'm happy for that. But I was thinking that actually after a shark attack, you don't end up in a hospital. You're somewhere on a graveyard. So, but not on the hospital.
Depends. No, many do end up in hospital.
I think it's a question of, this gets to the difference between, risk normalization versus risk novelty.
Yeah.
Because novel risks. And I mean, now I'm going to conflate the Knightian distinction between risk and uncertainty. But let's just use risk in a lowercase colloquial sense. A novel risk, because it is much more uncertain, we don't have any prior experience with it, we tend to react, in terms of risk perception, we react more assertively to it. We hedge our bets, and this is sort of the system one kind of thinking, right? If we see a shadow in the grass, we hedge our bets and assume it's something out to get us, because it's better to, oh look, there we go.
This one, isn't it?
Yeah, there you go. Right. This is it. So Kahneman there is referring to the anchoring effect or availability bias. Thank you.
Availability bias and silence persistence.
Right, exactly. So we tie our set perceptions of risk to recent memories, to previous experience, even if that experience isn't actually representative of the distribution. Right. I mean, and that's the difference between objective measurement of risk and subjective measurement of risk. And to some extent, as Common, I think, would show in his work, Common and Tversky, the system one mind is the fight or flight response, and the fight or flight response is, let's hedge our bets. Let's assume this shadow in the grass is something out to get us because the downside cost is so great. And that is a response to uncertainty, a natural response to uncertainty. If we are used to accepting a risk, we normalize it.
So yeah. I'm going to continue along on that one because I'll do this with Lexi first. So what are the colors of the center two squares?
What are the colors of the two center squares?
So that one there and that one there. I presume you can see my mouse pointer.
Yes. Oh well, I wouldn't think too much. So yes, it's brown and yellow. Actually, no, it's yellow is on the top. No, it's yellow on the top. I would say it's orange, probably.
Brown and orange. Eric?
Yeah, I would say brown and mustard yellow. So somewhere between what we think of as sort of sunflower yellow and orange.
Yeah, well, actually, they're both exactly the same color. So it's one of those illusion type things.
Right.
And clicking on to the next slide on this, it's a bit like square A and square B. Just because it's in a shadow, it looks like it's lighter, but it's actually the same color as square A and square B. And this is that comes back to your coconut, your shark, or whatever. You got a whole heap of risks that you've normalized.
Mm-hmm.
They're in the shadows, and then we just ignore them.
Right, that's it, and that's the.
And I would say social media was one of them, and that was the echo chamber that caused. We're going back to our original discussion of what was happening over in the White House. Sorry, just going to skip back to that slide.
Global pandemic.
Global pandemic. That's another one.
Right. It's the gray rhino or the gray swan. I mean, people see it, but those who see it don't necessarily affect the communal appraisal of the risk. They're fringe voices. The challenge, of course, is that you can find somebody who will argue for any risk, right? So it's how do you actually manage the gray rhinos, because there's an endless number of gray rhinos. And the reality is.
So isn't that our challenge? This is the main challenge for the Global Risk Institute of how do we surface up and engage in the minds of people and our members the risks that will matter. Yet we've normalized them, or we've ignored them, or there are things that are more salient, or the availability heuristics in play. That's our biggest challenge.
It is. And I think, there are a couple answers to that. I mean, the Taleb answer is build robustness and anti-fragility. So just make your organization better able to weather a broad array of risks across the distribution, and in fact, design them so that they become stronger as they're shocked. The other answer is try and, the challenge is that in order to do that, are the costs of that risk management quite high? And, you can try and be more selective in your risk management response and say, okay, I'm going to prepare for a certain representative sample of outcomes along the distribution, and hopefully that's going to make me more resilient, or robust. And I would agree because that's our challenge. Yeah, go ahead, Alexi.
Yeah, sorry, I had to go now. I have to pick my wife from work.
That's
today.
okay.
One day. So it was really cool. I really like what we have today. So, and Bruce, I'll definitely follow up with you how to actually make it myself. So it's a really cool thing. I really liked it, especially how you played with
we'll
the
have a bit of
screens.
play around. That's all.
Yeah,
We should be investigating the technology, how to reach our members and reach our audience. All right, good to see you again, Alexi. I'll switch
have
on.
a great weekend, Eric.
Actually, we might end up as well. We got way over time from our normal meeting schedule. But it was good. It was a good chat.
Yeah, it shows us what we can do with this technology. I mean, maybe even the video chat, like just doing that, maybe as a research team, being, let's have our bi-weekly research thinkers chat where we just talk about risks. I mean, there's so many different things you can do with this platform, so it's cool to see what we're capable of doing.
All right, so we'll sign off here. I'm going to work out how to end the stream. But bye-bye to the rest of the audience. I don't think we have anyone left. Maybe it's Sally.
It's Julie. Bye-bye, Julie.
See ya, guys.